Star Wars Battlefront 3 at EA was a thing. The developers were trying to get the game made. So now in 2025, where is the game? Why don't we have it? Why does Battlefront 3 not exist?
Money!
I spent the last 2 days doing a bunch of digging to find every reason we don't have Battlefront 3 and why, honestly, we're probably never gonna get it. We don't live in the reality where Battlefront 3 was greenlit and we got the Star Wars game of our dreams. In the past few weeks, new footage and a new build of the original Battlefront 3, which was cancelled all the way back in the late 2000s, was just revealed. And I think everyone agrees, seeing this footage, seeing what the game was going to be, basically the game of our dreams, the space-to-ground combat, the amount of heroes, the different classes, the different maps, at the time it would have been pretty mind-blowing, which is also what some former developers said. Michael Barclay, who previously worked on Battlefront 3 and is now a lead designer at Naughty Dog, said this a few years ago. I feel like it's been long enough now to come out and say Star Wars Battlefront 3 was going to be legit incredible, and the fact it got cancelled 2 yards from the finish line is an absolute crime. Gamers don't know what they were robbed of. Oh, believe me, we do know what we were robbed of. Hey everyone, it's Andrew. It seems like Battlefront 3 is one of those cursed titles that's just never gonna get made. It's a tragic story that Battlefront has been through, with not only the chaos surrounding the release of EA's Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2, the loot box fiasco, and I guess the fact EA didn't really make the money they thought they would on the game, considering all microtransactions were removed, is still part of the reason we never got Battlefront 3, even though that was such a long time ago now, way back in 2017. It's 8 years ago. Basically time for a reboot of the series, which I'll get into a bit later. The entire franchise also just seems to be kind of cursed in recent years, with the release of the Battlefront Classic Collection as well, also going kind of horribly, if we're all being honest. There is a server browser, pick a session to join. So what's it going to take to get Battlefront 3 made, and why has it never actually been released? Why do they rob us of these things? I just want to play as my favorite Star Wars characters and watch those wrist rockets. It's kind of become common knowledge in the Battlefront community that Battlefront 3 was pitched by the EA developers who built Battlefront 2 to EA to get it made. But unfortunately, they turned it down, stating they didn't want to pay the licensing costs. And part of this is according to Insider Gaming's Tom Henderson on Twitter, who a few years ago stated Battlefront 3 was a pitched title from DICE, but ultimately the title was shot down by EA due to licensing costs. It got turned down because it takes 20% more sales to make the same money. But what does this actually mean? Well, if EA actually decided to make Battlefront 3, the game would be assigned to DICE, the studio that of course built Battlefront 2 and Battlefront 1. But at this point in time, EA had different plans for DICE. Following the also chaotic and terrible release of Battlefield 2042, which part of the Battlefront 2 team went to work on following their development on Battlefront 2, EA decided to continue development on Battlefield and then drop Star Wars altogether to work on another Battlefield title. Battlefield is an EA IP, which means they own all of the licensing, all of the branding. It's their franchise. Therefore, they don't need to pay themselves licensing fees to make and produce and market another Battlefield game. However, if they went with Star Wars Battlefront 3, for example, they would have had to pay Lucasfilm and Disney, I can't imagine what amount of money to start development on a new game.
$100 billion!
And then a bunch of the profits of the game would of course go to Disney and Lucasfilm. I think we can draw a good comparison to the FIFA series, with FIFA 23 being the last FIFA game and all games following now being called EAFC. And part of the reason this decision was made, that there are no more FIFA games basically, even though it's the same game with a different name, was because of licensing fees. EA's contract with FIFA was up for renewal, and FIFA was reportedly asking for something like $1 billion for them to use the FIFA name and brand. And so EA were like, you know what, we're not going to spend $1 billion. Let's just drop the FIFA name, the FIFA branding, and make the same game. And I think a similar thing has happened here with Star Wars Battlefront. EA probably didn't think it was going to be worthwhile money-wise and business-wise paying the licensing fees to Disney for Star Wars and the Star Wars franchise, the Star Wars branding, the Star Wars name, and decided that perhaps making a game using their own IP, Battlefield, would make more money. Unfortunately, it's a little different to FIFA, and they can't just make the same game and not call it Star Wars, but I think you get what I'm trying to say here. So in 2019, I interviewed the the lead developer on Battlefront 2, Dennis Brandville, and it's crazy that something I asked him in that video is still relevant 6 years later. I asked him to describe the hardest part of his job in one word, and he responded by saying,
approvals.
It seems like working with Disney, working with Lucasfilm, can at times potentially be a bit of a nightmare, because you're not just making the game according to your studio. You have to take into account what they want in the game. Going back and forth, getting approvals, seems like it can be annoying. And this is part of why EA have also moved away from FIFA and are doing EA FC instead. Apparently there were things they wanted to do with the game that FIFA didn't necessarily allow them to do, so they're like, okay, we'll just drop the name and we want to do those things, because it's not part of our contract. You can't say we can't do those things anymore. Perhaps it's the same for Star Wars.
It's a trap!
But hold up. This is Star Wars we're talking about. It's literally a money printing machine. There is currently no other multiplayer game in the Star Wars space that is making a ton of money. So why not just make Star Wars Battlefront 3? And yes, before you say it, before you write it in the comments, I know we do of course have Star Wars Hunters, which technically, yes, is an online multiplayer Star Wars game, but it doesn't quite scratch the same itch as a AAA Star Wars multiplayer title like Battlefront. Star Wars Hunters has its own community, isn't a bad game, but it's a mobile game, essentially. It's not a AAA, big budget, highly detailed, expansive Star Wars Battlefront experience. But with that said, it still seems like this is the perfect opportunity for someone to make a Star Wars Battlefront 3. If not EA, considering they no longer have the exclusive license to make Star Wars games, which they had for 10 years, why doesn't someone else just go and make a Battlefront 3? Why is no one approaching Disney or Lucasfilm and saying, hey, we have this idea for a multiplayer, big-scale Star Wars game, let's do it? Well, perhaps it is happening behind the scenes, but I think it's more likely that no one wants to take the risk. If a new studio or developer or publisher was to make Battlefront 3 or a new Battlefront game, it would have to be bigger and better than what Battlefront 2 currently is. And by the end of Battlefront 2's development, it's a pretty damn good game with a lot of content. To start from the ground up, from scratch, using an entirely different game engine, new concepts, new characters, new everything, is probably too big a risk that any developer is willing to take. Also, who else is going to do it? Let's be real. EA and DICE were kind of the perfect studio, you'd think, to work on a Battlefront game. Considering their experience with the Battlefield games, it did feel like a match made in heaven. Not saying there are other studios out there that can't do it, but I think if a Battlefront 3 ever does get developed, it's going to end up being called something else altogether. It's too much of a risk making Battlefront 3 and associating it with the previous Battlefront games, which are kind of now also a bit tainted. And that's the other thing. Even though you probably know this, who's watching this video, I know this. Being part of the Battlefront community, having played the game continuously over the last few years, even following its cancellation, we all know Battlefront is a great game. What the developers did with the game towards the end of its life cycle have truly resurrected Battlefront. It's also interesting that a couple of years ago, DICE came out and said that we are only focusing on Battlefield 2042. There is no time for anything else. And this is what we want to do. In 3 years, we want to be the first-person shooter powerhouse that DICE deserves to be, and that's what we're going for. And the interesting thing here is that I think Battlefield 2042 has kind of had a similar development pattern to Battlefront 2, in that a lot of current players who still play Battlefield 2042 seem to really enjoy the experience. The DICE have fixed a lot of what was wrong with the game at launch, which at times was completely unplayable. Battlefield 2042 seems to have a pretty solid, consistent player base on Steam. But if we're talking about comparing how big an audience for a new Battlefield game is versus a new Star Wars Battlefront game would be, I think Star Wars got you beat, EA. Imagine the hype of a Battlefront 3 getting announced. Everyone would lose their minds, even with where Star Wars is now. Even if Star Wars isn't necessarily as popular as it was 2 years ago, following some of the TV series we've had, following some of the hit and miss games we've had, the reactions to those, even with where Star Wars is now, I think everyone would be crazily excited to see a Battlefront 3 get announced. But a lot of the casual gamers who play other games, or even the corporates who are in control of getting these games made, the investors, people like those, probably all still see Battlefront as that game that had all those loot box transactions go crazy when it was launched.
Am I in big trouble, mister?
They probably still remember things like legislation being changed around child gambling and what developers are able to put in their games when it comes to microtransactions and loot boxes because of Battlefront 2. The name itself is so tainted now. It has so much negativity surrounding it that I feel like no other developer at this point in time is going to want to touch it. So if we ever do get a Battlefront 3 somewhere down the line, it'll probably be called something entirely different, even if it does have the same gameplay mechanics and is a similar style of game where you can also watch those wrist rockets. Okay, but hold up. Do we even need Battlefront 3? Why not just go back to Battlefront 2 and continue developing that game? That game had such a comeback, and it was so strange to hear it being fully cancelled, kind of in the middle of that when it was still kind of peaking in 2020. First of all, that's never going to happen because it's already been confirmed. Most of the developers who worked on Battlefront 2 left the studio because the team was disbanding because they wouldn't let them do Battlefront 3. It's funny that also back in 2019, Dennis Brandvold said it's not the same hunger as it used to be for making sequels. We are so used to the chain of sequels, where we do a sequel, then we do a season pass for a year, then move on to the next game. I think the industry has changed on that. You focus instead on getting value to players out of what they paid for, rather than just improving it in the sequel. And then he goes on to use the example of the spawning system in Battlefront 2, how they changed this midway through the game's development, saying they listened to player feedback and decided to change it for Battlefront 2 versus just listening to it and then not changing it and maybe changing it for Battlefront 3 instead. Okay, but so if there isn't hunger for sequels, then why not just continue development on Battlefront 2? Well, there are a number of issues here. First of all, I'm sure all of the investors and the higher-ups at EA would not have been happy with the decision to remove all microtransactions from the game, essentially. When this happened around the time of launch, they basically missed a lot of money. And yes, Darth Vader being locked behind a paywall was incredibly infuriating, but to them it was just a business decision, albeit a very, very, very poor one.
I think it's too much.
Towards the end of the game's development, the only real monetization model EA put into Battlefront 2 was the Celebration Edition. The release of that, basically a re-release of the game with all of the added content, was the only way they chose to monetize the game. However, apparently things like a Battle Pass were pitched by the DICE developers and turned down. Instead, the game was just cancelled. I think players would have been so fine with something like a Battle Pass, similar to what Fortnite has, in that here you can buy the updated content, the DLC, from day one of release, or you can play the game for a couple of weeks and unlock it in-game instead. It's either you buy it now or you grind it out. But apparently, at the time, EA weren't interested in really that or just continuing. They basically had enough. They felt Battlefront and Star Wars, for the most part in that respect, was tainted. They didn't want to be in the online Star Wars space anymore, it seemed, and so they decided to cancel Battlefront 2. It just does seem to be one of those cursed titles, though. There's also plans in the early 2010s to develop another Battlefront 3 after the cancellation of the previous Battlefront 3, which eventually got evolved into Elite Squadron, and we had the leaks for recently. There was also this other cancelled Star Wars game called Star Wars First Assault, which was basically a Star Wars take on the Call of Duty franchise. It was supposed to be kind of a grittier first-person shooter, and then the second game in that series, a sequel to that, was titled Project Wingman, and this incorporated more vehicle-based gameplay, and then the third game in that series was going to be a new Battlefront 3, which expanded on both of these games and would have added space-to-ground combat, and this was, at the time, an approach to making Battlefront 3 that felt sustainable, that didn't make the project feel too massive, because they were basically developing parts of Battlefront 3 in the first two games. Like I said, the idea of Battlefront 3 just seems too big and too grand to ever make. Perhaps it is too big an ask. Perhaps the space-to-ground combat, perhaps the large-scale battles, perhaps the licensing fees, perhaps the expanded hero roster and amount of reinforcements and characters and heroes, everything that goes into making a Star Wars online multiplayer game is just too hard to make. But it still feels like an opportunity for one of these studios, one of these developers, to make a lot of money. Perhaps this is what could revive Star Wars. Do it. I watched a few other videos when researching this, including some from Battlefront updates, some from Aussie Jedi, and also the Act Man. Shout out to those guys. You can also find a bunch of information about the cancelled Battlefront 3 on the Free Radical Archive website, and subscribe if you want to live in the reality where Battlefront 3 is just like the simulations. Watch this video here for more Star Wars. Come follow me on Instagram, Twitter, join my Discord and TikTok, and thanks for watching this. My name's Andrew. Catch you soon.